So I was going to start with an anecdote, and the anecdote is about a a mother that we were working with about 4 years ago in a parent-to-parent organization. And long story short, you're familiar with the concepts of technical and adaptive and leadership and authority that we talked about before. So, the long story short is this mother had put a handrail into her daughter's school because her daughter was physically challenged, and she felt quite proud that she did that, and it was great for her daughter and some of the other students who also needed a handrail to get up the ramp to the restroom, to the bathroom, the girls' bathroom. The challenging notion for her, for the mother, when we talked, was that that was a technical approach, and the more adaptive approach would have been to get the school, the principal, and the senior administrators to take more responsibility for the health and welfare and safety of their children. So, and so there's a little more detail to it, but that's kind of one simple way to think about the difference between a technical problem and an adaptive problem. And as we think about leadership, this would be my next point, we think of leadership as the process of mobilizing people to face challenges for which there are no easy answers. And so the leadership work there would have been mobilizing the school, the principal, to actually do that work. And so as we think about the work that we do in early childhood development, from whatever angle we come at it, many of us are focused on providing a service, or providing or honoring a contract, or developing and delivering curriculum or programs. And while that's really important work, in the same way that the handrail was really useful, the leadership opportunity we suggest might be thinking about how do we mobilize the organizations, the communities, the systems in which we work to make early childhood development more of a priority than they currently do, and to really take ownership for that, not just leaving it to the technical experts to do the work for them. So that would be the intro, if you will, and then I could go into a more general definition, perhaps, of adaptive leadership, where loss shows up, and some other kind of personal anecdotes of my experience with this work.
Well, I will tell you, I think what you just did is very nice. And I think that's a lovely example that'll have, I could actually draw some clips from there. Because what I like about that example is that it really, while you showed it from a parent's perspective, it really also could apply from a teacher's perspective of seeing something, a need in the organization, and having the posture not that, oh, that's not my problem, that's the director's problem, but having this idea of, okay, I have a personal responsibility on how to promote the kind of environment and culture for the children and families. And so where is my role as a teacher to help influence decisions like that? So I think that anecdote is lovely, and we could actually use just what part of what you've shared. And so if, for example, so all this part where I'm chatting, we're going to take this out, because I'm going to have spaces where it's just your voice. I'm going to kind of lay the groundwork, and then you will, I will use that example. Now, for example, if there's something else you want to share about kind of a definitional perspective, you can. Or if you want to move on to the kind of the next question that I shared, how would you like to proceed?
Okay. Well, I think a little bit of definition might be helpful. And then the next question is it the question around leadership without authority? Is that the one that we're talking about, or? Right, right. Okay, good. So I'll give it, that would be more of a definitional piece. And I'll have to think about, uh, and maybe we can work together on an example, because I have examples from child welfare where child welfare workers have been engaged in one of the states that we work in to lead practice change from the front lines. Clearly, not from a place of authority or limited authority, but exercising what authority they do have in the service of getting the focus on, in that case, how to empower teams of investigators and permanency and planning workers to really challenge some of the statewide policies around things like concurrent planning or a number of different policy areas. So the example would be more how they partnered with authority, and in some cases had to disrupt the status quo, which is one way we think about leadership in the service of better outcomes for children and families. So that would be the example that I would have in mind. It's not necessarily early childhood, but it's related.
So if we take that same basic construct, for example, and we think about the, policies and procedures that get implemented by a director, in a program serving, because our audience is serving particularly young children, so infant care and toddler care, so children kind of, not birth, but a few months to say 3 years. And that the director has, policies or procedures about how the caregivers should, care for the children, interact with parents. So I'm not so much trying to get to a specific example as kind of a process example. So instead of, as a teacher, whereas let's say there is a process or a procedure that you really believe is not working ideally for the children that are in your care, and that maybe there is an adjustment that you believe would really help improve the quality. And so instead of saying, that's really not my job, or, this director doesn't have a clue about what I do on a daily basis or how this classroom should work, and so I'm just frustrated and aggravated and I feel like I'm helpless in this situation. How might taking an adaptive approach reflect that teacher's personal ability, responsibility to speak to that issue, to be able to share that with the leadership? How might a person who is in that situation move from a space of, I have no influence, I have no authority, to how I might think about myself as leading from where I am? How might that show up? Does that make sense? It's kind of a generic scenario.
Yeah, it does, and you said it better than I could, I think. But that, in fact, the example it makes me think of, which I could share, is in my own. I have 3 children, and the two youngest are still in preschool, essentially, and the preschool itself is a terrific classroom located in a kind of community center in our little town. And the director of the community center actually took it upon herself to decide to move the parking authority for the city or the township right next to the classroom. And so now we have all these members of the general public who are, as we all are, often angry that they have to pay parking tickets, having to fork over that money within feet of where my children come in and out the door. And from a parent's perspective, we were quite upset that the center wasn't really taking responsibility for that. They were seeing it more in a technical way. And so partnering with the actual preschool teacher, we're able to ripen a conversation with the center and the township more broadly about what is really their role. What do we, besides the technical work of educating kids, how are we actually caring for the safety of these children as they come in and out? And why was that not even taken into consideration? Now, as a parent, there's only so much we can do, but in partnering with the teacher who, let's admit it, it's a preschool teacher in a center that, for whom the school doesn't make a whole lot of money. So she had very little authority. But in partnering with parents and actually disrupting the status quo that way, we were actually to ripen a conversation. Now, the parking authority is still there, but you better bet the next decision that comes along will be given much more careful consideration than this one was. And so, as a small example of leadership, but it took a certain amount of risk taking for parents, of course, who don't want to stick their necks on the line, but also for a new teacher who has much more reason than not, perhaps, to not stick her neck on the line. So that just an example that comes to mind. And I didn't share that specifically, but it popped up in my head as you were talking about the more general example.
Yeah, that's a great example. And, as we are going along, you're sharing some, lovely tidbits, because I may be pulling some of that and putting it in, because I am still in the process of kind of writing the script of designing the session of how it's going to go. And so what I'm planning to do is to be able to pull clips from your presentation, clips. I'm also interviewing some teachers and directors. And so we'll be integrating those clips as to help illuminate, a part of the content that I'm sharing. So even that may be a piece. So one of the things that I really feel like that you can really help us with is trying to kind of that definitional piece. So using both the examples that we've just talked about, but also from your kind of, the theory of adaptive practice, of adaptive leadership, how would this kind of introductory audience, because this is new to them, be able to understand what adaptive leadership means and how that is different from kind of the boss perspective, the hierarchical perspective of leadership.
Excellent. Are we on video now? I mean, are you recording now as we speak?
I am recording now because it's easier for me just to go on. So we can now move into kind of the formal part, but it doesn't mean that some of the earlier part I still might use pieces from it.
Good. Glad we got it out. So should we just continue talking about some of the definitional pieces? So one of the most important, we call it behavior in adaptive leadership, is distinguishing between the two kinds of problems that you typically face when you're exercising leadership. And those two kinds of problems are, on the one hand, technical problems, and on the other hand, adaptive problems. So let me explain what a technical problem is. A technical problem, very simply put, is a problem or a challenge, whatever the language is you prefer, for which the problem is clear and the solution is clear. So a simple example, other than the one I gave earlier on around the handrail, is a broken arm, right? So if a child has a broken arm, it's pretty clear what the problem is, right? Usually. And we don't need to sit around asking ourselves, well, gee, what do you think the problem is? The arm used to go straight. Now it bends at a very unnatural angle. It's a broken arm. And so the solution is also very clear. You go to a doctor, an expert in fixing broken arms. So a technical problem, because the problem and solution are clear, you often have a best practice or a program or a service, but you have expertise that actually can address the problem. And the work of fixing it resides with an expert or the authority. So technical problems are not unimportant. In fact, most of the problems we face on a day-to-day basis are technical. Most of the things that we do and that we feel good about doing, our skills, our professional identity, revolve around being good technical experts. And that includes, just as an example, the director of a school or a daycare center, or any of the folks you might work with on a day-to-day basis. So what's an adaptive problem then? An adaptive problem is one where maybe the problem is clear, but the solution isn't clear. Or maybe the problem and solution aren't clear. So let's think about the example that I gave earlier on around the handrail in the school, right? So what's the problem in that case? Well, the technical problem is that there's no handrail. But what might be the adaptive challenge there? Well, it would depend on who you talk to. If you ask the principal, he or she might have a definition of the problem that's different than what the parent had in this case. If you ask a teacher, they may have a different problem. And so with adaptive work, it's part of the challenge is actually mobilizing people to define what the problem actually is. And part of that work involves actually engaging them in the solution finding. So we believe in adaptive work. The way you see the problem often is part of the problem. And because we each see it differently, getting the stakeholders to the table to define the problem is a really critical part of the work. So having identified technical and adaptive challenges, then we have a choice when we face a problem in the workplace or in the community. Do we leverage our expertise to take a technical approach, or do we begin to work with the stakeholders involved? And one definition of leadership in our framework is that leadership is about mobilizing people to address adaptive problems. In other words, to address problems for which there are no easy answers, but that we can't ignore. So, by the way, just as an aside on that, the Affordable Care Act, I'm tempted as we're talking to get into that. What's the problem that's solving and all that. So I'm gonna maybe resist that urge.
I was gonna say what you just gave there is a beautiful definition. And what I'm gonna be doing is, for example, the reason I'm going into classrooms, because I'm an administrator, I'm not in the classrooms every day, is I'm going to be asking the teachers to reflect on some of these kinds of specific examples of where they had to, themselves kind of mobilize parents or other teachers or bring an issue to the attention of, the leadership team or the director to help move an issue forward. So that definition you just gave is perfect. That's lovely.
And so I'll give a few. So as you think about and begin to try to identify what are the adaptive challenges or adaptive problems you face, there are a few indicators or flags that you can look for. The first is that adaptive problems, unlike technical problems, often require making tough choices between competing priorities. So on the one hand, schools do care about the safety and welfare and health of their children. It's not often a question, but they also care about paying the bills. They also care about raising funds. They also care about training teachers and supporting teachers. So there's a really tough choice, and you would think that it shouldn't be that tough, but as we all know, schools often have limited funding. And so the choice between, when and how much to invest in facilities is up against some other things that are competing for attention. So anytime you find that there's a value choice or priority choice, you may be dealing with an adaptive kind of challenge. The other thing with adaptive challenges is they don't reside in your head. Technical work is intellectual, analytical work. And adaptive work tends to be below the neck. It's something that really grabs you in the gut, in the heart. It's about making tough choices, but it's also about how you see yourself as a professional, as an educator. And many of us, I assume, got into the work that we do because we really wanted to add value in the particular program that we studied. But it could be that we're being called on to do a different kind of work. So rather than focusing on the program or the initiative or the service, part of the work may be mobilizing the community. It may be mobilizing parents. It may be mobilizing middle managers in our schools or organizations so they can address some of their own issues as an organization and make better choices about the kind of services we provide. Now, some of us don't want to deal with the quote-unquote politics or the bureaucracy, and yet, if we choose to, the leadership opportunity is also there to intervene in those systems as well. And so the sense of who am I as a professional, my identity, is often under question when you're doing adaptive work. And then lastly, adaptive work, it requires a good degree of change oftentimes. And we've all heard the expression that people don't like change. I would suggest that people don't resist change per se. What they resist is loss. The idea that they might have to give something up, the way that they know how to be, control, authority, autonomy, status quo, comfort, these are all forms of loss that people oftentimes are asked to give up in order to create room for adaptation and change and progress. And so rather than trying to mobilize people based on the merits of our idea and building PowerPoint presentations, umpteen pages long to prove why our idea is the best idea, a better strategy often is to look at where does the loss show up? What might people have to give up in order to get on board with the adaptive change? That's a very different way of thinking about identifying and mobilizing people around adaptive challenges. So if you see loss showing up in an organization, that might be, again, another flag that you're dealing with an adaptive challenge.
That's lovely. I hope I didn't cut you off, but that was very good. That came across beautifully.
I only gave you 3, but
there are little sections where I'm getting a little bit of a delay. I think from just the transmission, but generally speaking, it all came through pretty clear. Of course, we'll send you the total video as well as when I put it all together. But if you see some places where it looks like the transmission is a little bit delayed, that showed up a few times, but that's okay. So, David kept saying, don't make this too long because it's going to make the editing process challenging. So I think we've gotten at some core elements that really would help illuminate the practical examples that I intend to integrate into this process. Is there anything, final thoughts you think we want to share? Because I really don't want to utilize too much more of your time, and I think we've covered some good foundational information.
No, we don't mind at all when not spending the time. This is really important, so I want to make sure that you get what you need, and I'm happy to spend more time, David aside. I guess, just a personal anecdote. So this is about 6 months ago. It was 2:00 in the morning, and I found myself literally in my father-in-law's shower, fully dressed, mind you. But of all things, I was installing 2 handrails. My father had just broken his hip while he was on business travel in Colorado, and he lives in New Jersey. He's in his 80s, and I'm sitting there at 2 in the morning, saying to myself, "What a great son-in-law I am to be installing a handrail at 2 in the morning." When it occurred to me that I was doing exactly what this parent in Colorado was doing that I talked about earlier on, and so I had to smile, as exhausted as I was, and wonder, I wonder if I'm facing an adaptive challenge here too that the handrail is not going to solve. And as I reflected on it, of course, I realized that here's my father-in-law in his 80s. What the heck is he doing in Colorado on a business trip? And is this a sign of other changes that are coming as he grows older and the family has to begin to adapt how it supports him and how it thinks about its own role and identity in the family? And so we're still very much in the midst of that adaptive work ourselves. But for me, the learning there was, as much as I myself think about this work on a day-to-day basis, the opportunity for leadership and leading change and helping people not only survive but thrive in a changing world is everywhere. And if we just kind of care to look around us, open our eyes, and see the possibilities, we can see that whether you're a teacher or a parent or even a director or just a son-in-law in a bathroom at 2 in the morning, authority is a resource, but it certainly isn't necessary to lead change in how people grow.
Wow, that's beautiful. I love the last part because that is so much where I'm trying to um, emphasize in this session. We did some sessions last year at NTI. I wasn't involved in them, but they really were all about this idea of leadership as position, as authority, as role. And I just feel like we have the people on the front line serving babies and young children have so much potential for influence and for leadership and for cultivating a care culture that really helps children and families thrive, but help them in their own sense of professionalism and the ability to impact their workplace in a positive way. And I think that this theory, this approach to thinking about leadership is such an empowering message for people who are serving, in a profession who many don't think of as a real profession and who often feel like they're kind of at the whim of the people who are in authority. And what I'm really trying to do is to instill this idea that you are leaders, both in your classroom, in your home, in your community. And that's where I love so much this kind of theory of adaptive leadership. So how what you just said does really, I think, emphasize the core element of what I want the people in this session to walk away from. Because we put out there that the target audience are people on the front lines, is their own of tapping into recognizing, appreciating their own power, if you will, or influence from where they are, or their own leadership from where they are.
Great.
So,
yeah. Good. What I want to say about that is leadership-led authority and all that would probably be a webinar 202.
Well, I tell you what, we're going to see what the receptivity of this is like and how this goes. And if it turns out that it is a topic that we want to explore further, I certainly am going to come back to you. Now, I would love to be able to do it that's not just pro bono, but you know how the early childhood feel is. But there may be opportunities where I could certainly invite you to have yourself an audience with, people connected to our organization. So we can really continue to share this message because I think the work that you all are doing is very powerful.
Well, thank you, Lynette. And just to kind of offer, so we've done a lot of work in child welfare in other kind of related areas, and I think one thing we've realized is that the receptivity of folks who work with children and families and communities to this work, for the reason you just talked about, is remarkable. I mean, there's been such uptake, such excitement. For me, some of the more powerful moments in the work have been with social workers, who've been struggling with no money in some of the poorest states in this country, have gone through this work of leadership, seen results, and then said they now remember why they got into this work 25 years ago. It's so powerful, and in part having seen that and knowing that work continues to grow, we're kind of preparing to make a commitment to a practice area, a real practice focus on child welfare, on human services, on the kind of work that you all do. And so in that spirit, I think we will have to learn a lot, but we realize to learn a lot, we can't, we need to change our business model in a way. So there may be opportunities as we kind of grow our practice to think about, having trainers come to NTI, for example, or, come speak at price points that are well below what we would normally do. And also we can kind of get that experience on the ground and have a broader set of folks that can deliver that. And so we can learn more about what is a really fast evolving field, I think, still. So nothing specific, but just say let's keep the conversation going and let's not assume that the kind of business needs alone can drive whether or not we can work together. So I think there's more opportunity now here than there has been ever before to think more creatively about how to do that, including online learning and things like that as well. So.
We 0 to 3 is also the home of the Early Head Start National Resource Center. And every year they have a national conference, and that is very much targeted at directors of early Head Start programs and frontline teachers, and also parent leaders. And I'm telling you, this is the kind of message that would be so powerful to that community. So I'm going to certainly share your information with the director. And as you know, we also are the home of that home visiting, the kind of National Home Visiting Center. So we are the umbrella for some other programs that have a national reach. And I think this would be my goal is to really advocate that people give this perspective some thought. You know, I learned about this. We had to read the book Leadership Without Easy Answers for a fellowship, a leadership program that I went through. It was a 2-year fellowship program called the Wild Acres Leadership Initiative, which is in honor of William Friday from North Carolina, who was the president of the UNC system for years, and just had this amazing, remarkable posture as a leader through some very difficult times in North Carolina. But that fellowship program uses this idea of adaptive leadership as a very core element in it. So, you know, they're using this work, and it might be some connections you might want to make. But it had, I think, a very transformative impact on me and how I think of leadership. And certainly as my role at 0 to 3, this is what I'm trying to advance. So.
Well, thanks for sharing that with that. I mean, you know, as we kind of toil away in New York and other places in the world, to hear that others have been touched by, but also are using this in a very practical, hands-on way is why we do the work. So I really appreciate you sharing that story with us. And I'll look into the Wild Acres Leadership Initiative too, and learn. That particular book is probably the hardest of the 3 books to wrap. So the fact they're using that one and not the other 2 or 3 as a foundation for the piece of work signifies to me the seriousness with which they're taking on adaptive leadership in the program.
I will tell you, so that I did that program in 2008 to 2010. And it was some work to get everybody to read that book. And I was, you know, some people didn't, but I loved the core idea. And so I got through the whole thing. And it's a book that I go back to pretty regularly. And I haven't read the one on the kind of practical implications yet, but I'm going to soon. So I know we got to go. Thank you so much. I won't keep you any longer. And I'll be in touch with you once we get this all edited down, and certainly we'll share it with you. If there's anything I can do to be helpful to you, don't hesitate to let me know. And give Zoe a big hug for being so helpful.
Right on.
So I'll be in touch. Thanks so much.
All right.
Bye. Bye.